Hello everyone, and welcome to the next video in our series of bite-sized employment law guides looking at issues arising out of the pandemic. This is the second part to our data protection discussion. So in the last video, we looked at the legal framework, and in this video, we're going to be looking at the specific guidance from the ICO on, for example, workplace testing and surveillance and a few other areas. So, Sara, if we start with the ICO's guidance on workplace testing, they've set out some quite useful practical tips in a sort of quite accessible question and answer fashion, haven't they? Is there anything in particular that you picked up on in terms of useful points that we can derive from the guidance?
Well, Emily, at the heart of the ICO's advice is what's called the data minimization principle. So that comes from Article 5(1)(c) of the GDPR. So to break that down even further, you're talking about the data being processed. Is it adequate? Is it relevant? And is it limited to what is necessary in relation to the purpose?
And I think just to highlight some of these specific practical tips that the ICO have given us, because there are some quite useful ones that illustrate the data minimization principle. First of all, they say avoid collecting unnecessary or excessive information. In terms of a practical tip, they say you will probably only require information about the result of a test rather than additional details about underlying conditions. So I think that's a really important point for employers to be considering. Are you recording only the essentials, or is there anything extraneous that you should make sure that you don't record, such as an underlying condition? Were there any other practical tips, Sara, that you thought were particularly useful?
Well, I think accuracy is very important here. So with data, it's not just a processing of it, but your record has to be accurate. So you should record the date of any test results, because particularly with this pandemic, we can see that the health status of individuals is changing over time and the test result may no longer be valid. So if you've got data, it has to be accurate. I think that's something else that needs to be flagged up.
Definitely. So we've got accuracy, we've got making sure all the information is necessary. And thirdly, I think an important question that the ICO answered is it appropriate for employers to keep lists of employees who either have symptoms or have tested positive? Because I think that was a question on the lips of a lot of employers. And they have confirmed that, yes, that is appropriate, but with the caveat that such information may become irrelevant after a certain period of time. So at that point, you shouldn't keep storing the information, but you should ensure that it's deleted. Is there anything else that we should be highlighting in particular?
Well, I think something that a lot of employers and indeed employees are going to be very wary about are the number of other members of staff who are going to have coronavirus. So people are going to want to comply with health and safety obligations and know who those individuals are, but you should avoid naming the individuals if possible. I think that's really key, because I think people are going to want to know that information, but you shouldn't be providing more information than is necessary, and it often won't be necessary to name individual employees.
Exactly. So I think a potential scenario, I suppose, is where you know that a certain group of employees have been in contact with a certain individual. Just tell them, don't tell the rest of the workforce, because that's not necessary. Another area that I'm sure you picked up on as well, Sara, is surveillance. So there are various aspects such as temperature checks, thermal cameras, smartphone tracking. I suppose what we group under the umbrella of intrusive technology that people are talking about at the moment. And I think it's very important to be clear about the purpose and the use of such technology. That's certainly something that we get from the ICO guidance. So employees need to be aware of the information that's being gathered and what it's being used for. I think also crucial to ask in terms of these more intrusive types of technology, and can the information be gathered via another less intrusive means? So the most obvious example that strikes me is smartphone tracking. So that is particularly controversial, because it does infringe on the employees' right to privacy and liberty, obviously. So can there be a less intrusive method of collecting that information, such as asking employees to fill out questionnaires or to essentially report on their plans for travel in the coming weeks, rather than actually tracking them?
I think this is such a key point, Emily. Just because the technology is there that enables you to do certain things doesn't mean that you should do it. And that's a really important line that the ICO is helping employers and employees to tread. And one of the topics we are going to be covering later in this series is this interplay between employee surveillance and Article 8 of which is the right to private life. And I think that is going to be such a key topic. And again, it helps us navigate that line between what you can do and what you legally are permitted to do.
Yeah, totally. So in a separate video, I think we're going to be looking at new ways that employers are using to monitor their employees and workers. So for example, technology to see that they're being productive. I think there's been a few stories in the news in that regard recently, such as the story about PwC that you were telling me about, Sara.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think PwC ties in so neatly with this particular series because individuals who've been working from home, measures were brought in to surveil them. And this was predominantly done because they were working as traders in a financial setting. So there were issues that working from home, you couldn't have certain information about them as readily. But obviously, if you are surveilling your employees when they're at home, they're not in a work setting, they're in a personal setting, and the nature and extent of any invasion is going to be that much more.
I think it's also important to mention the risks of home working as well, which is a kind of separate area that the ICO have issued guidance on. So there's guidance called How Do I Work from Home Securely, which is sort of 10 practical steps to minimize the risk of data protection breaches when working from home. So a lot of practical steps in that regard, such as if you print out hard copies, store them safely, and be careful of where you get rid of them, be vigilant about web links and attachments and that sort of thing. And then the ICO has also issued guidance on home working for organizations. For example, not allowing staff to use their own personal emails or messaging accounts to process personal data, and reminding staff that access to cloud storage is only meant to be for the portions that are relevant to them and not for other aspects. So Sara, there was a tip regarding the National Cybersecurity Centre that you were telling me about as well. Do you want to touch on that briefly?
Yes, very much so, because when people are working from home, the risk of scams are that much higher because you're not able to confirm things sometimes with colleagues as easily as you would be able to otherwise. So you have to make sure that you're reporting any phishing emails and texts. And it reminds you, the very good guidance on the National Cybersecurity Centre, do check it out, to be cautious if you've got any communications which are threatening that urgent action is needed. That's something that scammers use very, very commonly. Go back to official sources. Now, banks, various other official sources are good at explaining what information they're going to ask from you and what information they're never going to request from you. So do make sure that you're very, very clear before you're sharing information.
Very important. And finally, before we end the video, I thought I'd mention the ICO's guidance on their regulatory approach. So they've said, and this should be quite welcoming news, that they will be taking an empathetic and pragmatic approach to regulatory enforcement when handling complaints received by individuals about organisations. So they're going to be taking into account essentially the impact of the pandemic and the difficulties that poses. So there will be a certain amount of leeway, but that is not to say by any means that employers are off the hook in terms of data protection breaches. employers. It's just that the approach will be, as I've said, more lenient. So I think that concludes our second video on data protection issues. Thank you very much for watching.